Good evening and welcome to each of you. Number 5 will be our starting song tonight. Number 5. When morning gilds the skies, my heart awaking cries, may Jesus Christ be praised. Alike that work and prayer, to Jesus I repair. May Jesus Christ be praised. The night becomes as day, when from the heart we say, may Jesus Christ be praised. The powers of darkness fear, when this sweet song they hear, may Jesus Christ be praised. In heaven's eternal bliss, the loveliest string is this, may Jesus Christ be praised. Let earth and sea and sky, from depth to height reply, may Jesus Christ be praised. May this while life is mine, my canticle divine, may Jesus Christ be praised. Be this the eternal song, through all the ages long, may Jesus Christ be praised. 15. 15. I thank you, Lord, for all you've done. I don't deserve your love. When I was lost, you saw my need and left your home above. I love you, Lord, I love you, Lord, because of Calvary. I love you, Lord, I love you, Lord, you're everything to me. You proved your love on Calvary, you bore my sin and shame. I'll live for you through all my days, I'll praise your holy name. I love you, Lord, I love you, Lord, because of Calvary. I love you, Lord, I love you, Lord, you're everything to me. 28. 28. This is my Father's world, and to my listening ears, all nature sings and round me rings the music of the spheres. This is my Father's world, Number 58 will be our next song together. Number 58, if you're able, we invite you to stand while we sing. There will never be a sweeter story of the Savior's love divine, love that brought him from the realms of glory, just to save a sinful soul like mine. Isn't the love of Jesus something wonderful, wonderful, wonderful? Oh, isn't the love of Jesus something wonderful, wonderful it is to be, boundless as the universal glory, reaching to the farthest soul away, saving, keeping, loving was that found me. That is why my soul can truly sing. Isn't the love of Jesus something wonderful, wonderful, wonderful? Oh, isn't the love of Jesus something wonderful, wonderful it is to be, love beyond our human comprehending, love of God in Christ, how can it be? This will be my theme and never ending, great redeeming love of Calvary. Isn't the love of Jesus something wonderful, wonderful, wonderful? Oh, isn't the love of Jesus something wonderful, wonderful it is to be?
May we bow for this prayer. I'd like to ask Brother Glenn Easter if he'll lead us in prayer, please.
Heavenly Father, thank you for this opportunity to be in your house tonight. And we bless the pastors who present your word. Bless them. Always give them the wisdom and courage to preach the word that you have to speak. We bless each and every one that they effort to be here tonight.
Amen. Please be seated. Well, we welcome each of you tonight. We hope you're comfortable. Didn't have to fight for a seat. Of course, I'm a little corny, you know that. Noelle's got me figured out. She finally said I was born with the tendency to make a joke out of everything. If you'd like to open your Bible to 2 Samuel chapter 5. 2 Samuel chapter 5, we'll be there in just a moment. And I guess most of you know that Dolores' sickness is COVID, so hopefully it will not be the real bad kind that she will have to contend with. Friday is a carry-in supper here at the church at 6:30, and then Saturday at 10 o'clock will be the VBS visitation, door to door, and then Saturday evening at 7:30 will be the men's meeting here at the church. Always be in prayer for the Sunday ministries, the Sunday school teachers, and the lessons that are being taught and the people that are receiving them. And I guess most of you are probably keeping up with things. I haven't heard the latest on Andy Keaton Sr. All I know was he was supposed to be dismissed from the hospital yesterday, but I don't have any further information on that. And then, of course, keep Sandy Adams and Charles Maston always in your thoughts and prayers. And those of our number that have lost mates, loved ones, I'm sure that you're aware of the fact they need a lot of comfort and they need a lot of prayer, because that's not an easy thing to get over. So pray for Mary and Glenn as they continue to deal with this and make the adjustments and heal. Always pray for those who are fighting for the right principles in our country. There are some who still are, and I don't know whether how that's going to be in the end, but pray for them. Always pray for other churches that are doing God's work. And Vacation Bible School, Monday. It seems like we've been talking about it, but all of a sudden here it is. And pray that our teachers, everyone that's a part of it, will have good health. There's a lot of things can go wrong to have a Bible school, so we want to pray that the things will go right, that we might be able to have it and give an opportunity for our children to be taught and have the fellowship in spiritual things. Well, tonight in 2 Samuel chapter 5, last week we had a message on David, so we're going to have another one tonight. This is when he is established as king. God says all the things that are written in the Old Testament are written for our learning and our admonition. So we can learn from all of this. And so we'll read the first 3 verses of chapter 5 of 2 Samuel. Then came all the tribes of Israel to David unto Hebron, and spake, saying, Behold, we are thy bone and thy flesh. Also in time past, when Saul was king over us, thou wast he that leddest out and broughtest in Israel. And the Lord said to thee, Thou shalt feed my people Israel, and thou shalt be a captain over Israel. So all the elders of Israel came to the king to Hebron, and King David made a league with them in Hebron before the Lord, and they anointed David king over Israel. So Judah had already accepted him, but now we find David being anointed king over the entire nation. In the 12th verse of this 5th chapter, it says, David perceived that the Lord had established him king. So David knew. This was not something that was a surprise to him, not something that he himself had been trying to bring to pass, but he had been waiting upon the Lord because he knew this was God's plan for his life. You go back to verse 2, and you notice also that Israel at this time, many years too late, but now they're saying, You're the one. You're the one that the Lord said, Thou shalt feed my people Israel, and thou shalt be captain over Israel. So it's kind of typical, I guess, but something to learn from, that a lot of times we don't respond to what we know. And something has to happen in order to get us to step up to that. Israel had failed to accept David on God's calling. They had failed to accept David on the fact that the Lord had anointed him to be king. They knew that. That happened back in 1 Samuel chapter 16, and that was about 15 years ago. So that was quite some time. They had that knowledge. But they had to suffer. They had to be brought to a great need before they would turn to David as the king that God had wanted them to have. David was the only one God would use to meet Israel's need. They also knew that because they mentioned that in the 2nd verse. You're the one that leddest us, and you're the one that brought us in Israel. So he was the one that, even though that the Spirit of the Lord was upon David instead of Saul, that was evident also. They knew it, they saw it, yet they still followed Saul. I think those are some things we have to think about a little bit. This is God's congregation. For 15 years, they have known, they have seen, but yet they're still not with God's plan and with God's program. God called David to be king over Israel, but his arrival there as king came by way of his unwavering faithfulness to God. That's something else to take into account. David didn't just step from being a shepherd boy to the throne just because God called him. There was a pathway of faithfulness that brought him to that. Circumstances were not favorable to David becoming king. And what knowledge you have of him, you will find that he always had to be delivered from his circumstances. Because at one point he even said, there's just a step between me and death. That's how hair-raising his life had been circumstantially. Most of the time, his circumstances just left him accounted as the most hated person in Israel. I don't know if they had wanted posters back then, but if they did, I'm sure Saul had them plastered all over Israel. So that was all because David was called of God. David was a faithful man to God. And that's the category that it put him in the minds of most of the people. So that's something else to think about. That's something else to digest that. So we want to look at the steps to his God-called position that God gave him. In the first chapter, we're not going to read all these verses, but we're just going to go back to that first chapter in 2 Samuel. And it gives us an account of how that things unfolded. But I want to apply the first Proverbs, the 3rd chapter, verse 5 and 6. When God says we're to trust in the Lord with all of our heart, and lean not to our own understanding, but in all of our ways acknowledge him, and he shall direct our paths. The word lean, I think, tells us the tendencies that we can choose to have. We can favor or rely on something for advice and encouragement. We can be inclined toward it, or we can be leaning the other way. So God says when it comes to our understanding, which is our way of reasoning, we're not to lean that way. That's the way we should lean the opposite from. All of us are well aware of what's going on in our mind, and we know that on a good day, we might have a certain view on something. On a cloudy day, it may be different. And God tells us, don't lean to your own conclusions. Don't lean to your own thoughts, but rather just trust in the Lord with all your heart. When you think about leaning to a person's own understanding, that's what brought the downfall of Saul. When we read back in the 15th chapter of 1 Samuel, God gave Saul a mission, and he told him very expressly, hearken to the voice of the words of the Lord. And the voice of the words of the Lord, that means everything God says, make sure that you understand it, that you're going to follow it. And God told him to utterly destroy the Amalekites. That was a judgment that God had pronounced upon them many years ago when they had opposed Israel as Israel was coming out of Egypt. And God had said that he was going to utterly destroy them. So he gave Saul that mission. He said, don't spare anything. Destroy it all. But in the 9th verse of that 15th chapter, it says that Saul and the people would not utterly destroy everything, but they spared. And they spared things that looked good to them. Saul leaned to his own understanding. He came up with his own version. And he came up with his own idea of what he thought was better. And God said, I can't use you as king anymore, because that amounts to stubbornness and rebellion when it comes to following the Lord's leadership. And then in this first chapter of 2 Samuel, you will find that there was a Amalekite that also leaned to his own understanding, and he brought about his own self-destruction. And the story is that everybody knew there was a conflict between David and Saul. Everybody knew that Saul was David's enemy by choice and that he wanted to destroy David. Human understanding of that would take you in the direction that this Amalekite went. And that is that after Saul, when you go back to chapter 31 of 1 Samuel, you'll find out how Saul died. And that is, he was losing the war, he was losing the battle. All of his sons were killed. He was sorely wounded. And so he asked his armor bearer to kill him, get him out of his misery, plus to not let the enemy come and abuse him and just make his death miserable. But the armor bearer wouldn't do it. He was afraid. And so Saul, in verse 4 of 1 Samuel 31, took his own sword and fell upon it. In other words, he took his own life. Then the armor bearer did the same thing when he saw that, because they were just in a hopeless situation. Well, you get into chapter 1 of 2 Samuel, and this Amalekite happened to be a scavenger, and so he got there to the battlefield where the dead bodies were before anybody else did, and he took the crown and a bracelet off of King Saul. And he brought it to David, and he told David a story that he just happened to be, in verse 6, he just happened to be going by Mount Gilboa, and behold, Saul was there, and he was sorely wounded, and he asked the Amalekite who he was, and he told him. And so the Amalekite said, Saul asked me to kill him because he was in so much pain. So he said, I did, in verse 10, and I was sure he could not live. So I took the crown that was on his head and the bracelet that was on his arm, and I brought them hither to my Lord. So he said, I killed him. Well, at that point, David took hold of his clothes and rent them, and likewise all the men that were with him, and they mourned. So this Amalekite, he's thinking that I can tell the story that I killed David's enemy, the one that was out to kill David, because you go over to 2 Samuel chapter 4 and verse 10, here's what he had in mind. 2 Samuel 4:10. When one told me, saying, Behold, Saul is dead, thinking to have brought good tidings, I took hold of him and slew him in Ziklag, who thought that I would have given him a reward for his tidings. So this Amalekite was an opportunist, and he thought, I can make up this story, and David will then look upon me as a hero. But it was a lie. But David treated his lie as a guilt. And so his own lie made himself guilty of murder in the court of justice, and David had him killed. So his lie was as serious as the act of murder. I think that's something to just store up here. When you think about how serious is a lie, in this case, it was as serious as the murder itself. David was not leaning to his own understanding, however. In the 14th verse of 2 Samuel 1, David said unto him, How wast thou not afraid to stretch forth thine hand to destroy the Lord's anointed? A long time ago, David chose to lay aside personal feelings and to follow righteous principles where Saul was concerned. He knew what Saul was up to. 2 different times David could have killed Saul. 2 different times he had the opportunity to do it, and he wouldn't do it. He said, no, the Lord put him in there as king, the Lord will take him out, and I'm not going to be the one to lift up my hand against him. So he had crossed that bridge a long time ago to let God be in charge, and his convictions regarding the righteousness of God's principles enabled him to even love those that hated him. As you see in verse 17, David lamented with this lamentation over Saul and over Jonathan, his son. So it didn't give David any pleasure at all that Saul had been killed, because even though that Saul was his enemy, he still loved him, and he still wished that things would have been entirely different than the way they were. David earnestly sought to establish himself in the place where God wanted him. In chapter 2 of 2 Samuel, you notice that it came to pass in verse 1, after this, that David inquired of the Lord, saying, Shall I go up into any of the cities of Judah? And the Lord said unto him, Go up. And David said, Whither shall I go up? And he said, Unto Hebron. David wanted to prove that which would be acceptable to the Lord in making his move, going up into Judah. God had anointed him to be king over all Israel. And so he must keep this in view and not just settle for being king over Judah alone. So he was to take this in the steps that God would unfold it for him. And keep this in mind, since God anointed David to be king over all of Israel, which included Judah and Israel, he was responsible. So if he just settled to be a king over only part of it, God would have to deal with him for not fulfilling his responsibility for the rest of his calling. Judah was the place of his inheritance in Israel. Striving to fill his place that God had set him in is what he had in mind first. I want to get the home base right, and we'll go from there. God had directed him back in 1 Samuel 22:5, if you recall last week, when David went up into the hold. God says, don't abide in the hold, get into Judah. And so David had done that. He had responded to God, and now he says, Lord, where shall I go in Judah? And so God tells him that you go to Hebron in the latter part of verse 1, and that's where he went. And so in verse 4 of 2 Samuel 2, the men of Judah came, and there they anointed David king over the house of Judah. And they told David, saying that the men of Jabesh Gilead were they that buried Saul. So we have David now being made king by the men of Judah, and David didn't make himself king. They came to him, God working on every end. God working on the end of the men of Judah, and of course God working and leading David. Both of that's a part of the story. Then we find that David's first course of action was to encourage people in the doing of right things. And the men of Jabesh Gilead had been the ones that had come and taken Saul's body down off of a wall. There was a story about that. And they had then buried him, given him a proper burial. So David, in verse 5 of 2 Samuel 2, David sent messengers unto the men of Jabesh Gilead, and said unto them, Blessed be ye of the Lord, that ye have showed this kindness unto your Lord, even unto Saul, and have buried him. And now the Lord show kindness and truth unto you. And I also will requite you this kindness, because ye have done this thing. Therefore now let your hands be strengthened, and be ye valiant. For your master Saul is dead, and also the house of Judah have anointed me king over them. Saul would have done the opposite. If somebody would have at all tipped their hat toward David, and you recall, if you can remember the story in reading it, that when David had fled, which we saw last week, and Abiathar the priest didn't know that David was fleeing, so he gave David the bread and the sword of Goliath in innocence, not knowing that there was anything going on. When Saul found it out from Doeg the Edomite, Saul had Abiathar and all the priests killed. If this would have been Saul, Saul would have had the men of Jabesh Gilead killed, because they had showed kindness to David. David was not of that frame of mind at all. He chose to encourage others in the right way. And then he identified himself. He reminded them that Judah has anointed me king. And they knew that he had been anointed by God to be king earlier. So he gave them an opportunity to respond and to follow, but he did not force himself on them. He did not say, well, you are now my subjects. You do what I say. In the 8th verse through the 3rd chapter in verse 6, Abner, who was the captain of Saul's host, he set up Saul's son Ishbosheth as king over Israel. And of course, this would just be a normal thing. The king is killed in battle, so his son who is alive is to succeed him. So Abner is just following protocol in doing that. And Israel accepted that in spite of the fact they knew David was the one that God had anointed. But they were just, for their own reasons, they could justify it. They said, well, you know, this is just a normal way it's done. Saul was king, he's dead, so his son is to take over. They could have justified it and had their own reasons, but they knew it was not God's plan. But that didn't stop it. Well, there was a conflict that issued as a result of Ishbosheth being made king, and the conflict was between the house of Saul and the house of David. In chapter 3 of 2 Samuel, there was long war between the house of Saul and the house of David. I think you could probably say there was a lot of political going back and forth like there might be today between, in our government, a divided government. And there was probably also physical wars. But David waxed stronger and stronger, and the house of Saul waxed weaker and weaker. Got any idea why? Because God was working to make that the way it would be. As David stayed on course with God's calling, the challenges that kept coming against him just made him stronger because God was upholding him. And then in the 7th through the 21st verse of chapter 3 of 2 Samuel, Abner revolted against Ishbosheth because Ishbosheth accused him of a sex crime, which he said he didn't do. And so then he turned against Ishbosheth. So the actual kingdom of Ishbosheth is pretty well weakened at this time because he's lost his strength, and that is Abner was his strength. And his kingdom now is just about broken. Abner comes to David. He tells David, I will work to bring Israel to you. I will work to bring them over to you. David agrees to that, but in the 30th verse, Joab and Abishai slew Abner because in a battle, Abner had killed their brother who refused to quit following Abner. Abner had told him, go back, I don't want to kill you. But he wouldn't go back. So Abner finally thrust him through with a spear, and now Joab and Abishai kill him because of something had happened on the battlefield, which that should never be. They should have considered that a battlefield casualty. David condemned that act, and in verse 31 through 39 of chapter 3, he disassociated himself with it entirely. And he took part in the funeral procession of Abner, giving honor unto Abner as having been a man of honor. And then in chapter 4, in the first 12 verse, well, the whole chapter, gives us an account of how that two of Ishbosheth's servants killed him when he was laying in a bed. They just went into his house under false pretense. He didn't think anything about it, and they killed him. And they cut his head off, and they brought his head to David. And they thought, man, they're going to get a big reward too, because Ishbosheth is of the household of Saul. And you notice in verse 10, when David responded to this in chapter 4, he said, when one told me, saying, behold, Saul is dead, thinking to have brought good tidings, I took hold of him and slew him in Ziklag, who thought that I would have given him a reward for his tidings. How much more when wicked men have slain a righteous person in his own house upon his bed? Shall I not therefore now require his blood of your hand and take you away from the earth?" So he had them killed. And they, of course, had confessed to this, thinking they were going to be rewarded, but David exercised the principles of God's righteousness in dealing with them. Now we come to the 5th chapter where we started in our reading, and we see that Israel now, Ishbosheth dead, and they're without a king. They now come to seek David as their king, and they cite 2 reasons for doing it. First of all, they say, well, you know, we're your bone and your flesh. Saul's dead, and therefore we need a king, and you're the one that God said should be the king. So their own kings had failed, the ones they had trusted. They now reflect upon what God had made possible for them to see and know. About 15 years too late, but they do. So God can get our attention if we won't listen to him in a voluntary way. And that's why God says we're to fear him. They knew who David was. They knew he had been used of God in their behalf. And they were aware of God having chosen him to be king. So none of that was something they didn't know, but they had just failed to act upon it. So they had every reason to follow David because of his uprightness and everything he had done to this point in response to Saul and Saul's house had been done on godly principles. It had not been done with vengeance or with hatred in mind. So we get to verse 10 in chapter 5, and it says that David went on and grew great, and the Lord God of hosts was with him. Verse 12, David perceived that the Lord had established him king over Israel, that he had exalted his kingdom for his people's sake. And verse 19, David inquired of the Lord. And so then it takes us into some of David's responses to situations, defending the country, and it was all about letting the Lord lead him. That explains how and why David became king and why his kingdom stood. There's no way to explain David becoming king over Israel except he was called and anointed by God. He was faithful to his calling to serve, and Israel came to accept him because of his faithfulness in serving. And that's something to sort of think about too when it comes to a ministry. 2 Peter 1, 10 to 11 says that above all, we're to make our calling and our election sure. A calling is unto service, not just a title. I know I heard a preacher say one time about a lot of those that claim to be called to preach. He said some churches have 4 or 5 people in them that claim to be called to preach, but they're just sitting in the pew. So God's calling is unto service, and that differs from seeking a position in that one may not serve until they acquire a guaranteed position. And so unless you give me a pulpit, I'm not going to preach. But if you give me a pulpit, I'll preach. When it comes to a calling, it's a service to be performed because of the calling. And it's the responsibility of that calling to go do it, rather than because that a person has a title and they're waiting on a place that they can just step into. David performed the service, then was given the position. He did not first seek the throne before he would perform the service as a king. So that's something to keep in mind about a calling. It's a calling to serve. A church must be seeking God's called servant to perform the service and be willing to afford the position, and God's servant must be seeking to fulfill his calling to serve, trusting in the Lord to provide that position as he serves. And then all of this is so important David never quit serving because he wasn't afforded a position of his liking. For years, David was a wanted person, and yet he continued to serve. He kept serving God in accordance with his calling to perform duties as a leader of Israel, even when Israel was unwilling to recognize him as their leader, and even when they opposed him as their leader. That's something else to think about. You know, a preacher can say, well, nobody seems to really like me, or people don't really seem to be wanting to follow me, so I'll just resign and quit. Well, David kept serving in accordance with his calling even when Israel was unwilling to recognize him and when they opposed him. He continued on to serve. Now, to me, that's a biggie, because humanly speaking, that's not the way it is. But that's the way it is with a calling. So though he was denied the position by men, he still performed the service out of faithfulness to the one who called him. That's why God preserved him. That's why God blessed him in being king. So his kingly position came to him as a blessing of God upon him for his faithfulness to his calling. That's how he had that position. Isaiah 6:8 says, I heard the voice of the Lord saying, whom shall I send, and who will go for us? Then said I, here am I, send me. So I think this is kind of a lesson on making our calling and election sure. And to serve God, we must first settle with that calling. And if a person doesn't know where the Lord wants them, and they don't know whether they should serve or not, it's just not going to work. May we bow our heads for prayer. Father, we ask your blessing upon your word tonight. We know that none of this is foreign to your work, even in our time. And so you have challenged us to make our calling and our election sure, to be established in your will, to know where you have set us, and to serve where you have set us, but above all, to serve in spite of where you have set us. Because if we get to thinking about our position and placement more so than service, then sometimes our thoughts get mixed up. So we just pray that you'll help us, because we realize the devil is doing everything he can, just like he did with David. He was after David 24/7, and it wasn't until that finally God set him in that place where he had chosen for him to be, that he had the peace and was no longer pursued by the enemy. But then he had to fight other battles, and that was a part of his service as being king. So bless your people who are faithful. May we rejoice in you being above all, to where that you can make it all work as we remain faithful and true to you. And we pray for your Spirit to give the invitation, for it's in Jesus' name we pray. Let's stand.